I'm Chris Irons from independent Strata consultancy Strata Solve. With me, as per always, Frank Higginson, partner, Hynes Legal. Frank, welcome.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone, for what could be what is going to be an interesting topic.
A colourful discussion. Let's call it that. Colourful discussion. We're going to go there today, people. We're talking about vaccinations in Strata. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who go, well, what's that all about? The two things are not connected. I can assure you they are connected in some ways you might not have thought of. We're going to try and go through the main ways that we think they are connected today, Frank. We might be a wee bit provocative in parts. Little
Why
bit.
not?
Just
well, I mean, it was even going there with this topic. I think it's sort of, I was talking to a client this morning who said, I'm so glad you guys are actually leading the charge on talking about it because no one else is. So, and it's the issue that's coming, like in terms of, I don't know about, I suppose, Chris, you're not sitting in the same office anymore, but in terms of the questions and queries I'm starting to get, particularly from last Tuesday when the Premier announced we are going to have segregation, have been pretty consistent. So why not knock it on the head?
Yeah, and well, as much as we can, of course, because as you just said, Frank, plenty of it is unknown, but we'll try and work our way through as much as we can today. As per always, ask us questions live and we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. If your question's a bit more detailed today, much better that you put those details into the link, which is coming up on your screen any second. Just fill in your details there and someone will get back to you. Okay. Vax and Strata, let's begin by a bit of a statement of the obvious, Frank. We're not doctors.
Epidemiologists or otherwise? No.
No. If there are any watching, hi, thanks very much for tuning in. We're also not conspiracy theorists, Frank, except for a laugh. So if you're going to tell us that vaccination is a better conduit to 5G, this probably isn't the webinar for you, I would suggest. Very respectfully. But yeah.
You're entitled to your opinion. Completely
Absolutely.
accept that. It's not something that probably either of us share, but there you go. So, and that's that thing. It's not an argument about science. We're not talking about whether COVID vaccines, or whether COVID's real, whether vaccines work or not. We're talking about how vaccination and I suppose the segregation that the Premier has announced mixes and intermixes with the Strata work that we both do. End of story.
And how it doesn't mix, for that matter, Frank. Yeah. So that intersection. Well, let's sort of confront it head on to begin with. The problem at the moment, as we see it, for whether you're on the committee, whether you're an owner, whether you're a tenant, and tenants are going to have a big part in this discussion. Occupiers is the technical term for them. Whether you're a manager, whether you're a caretaker, there's very little explicit guidance, Frank, isn't there?
There's none, and that's mate. It's interesting in the context of, you go back to when COVID arrived in March last year. And I think I was saying to someone this week, I got no problem with the days of the week at the moment, but the years I'm really struggling with. Is it 2019, 2021? We're about to be 2022. But when COVID arrived, it was just, panic stations. No one knew what was going on. We had health directions on the run, probably pursuant to policy announcements as opposed to the other way around. This, when the Premier came out last week, is not dissimilar in the sense of here's this big, bold, brassy announcement. This is what we're doing. And there has been a substantial lack of detail. And one of the things with certainly those first round of health directions, as you recall, mate, we're doing webinars every other week when these started, is there was no distinction in there for Strata. It was that we talk about, well, the health directions are talking about, you got to close gyms. What does that mean in a body corporate gym? Because it wasn't defined and it wasn't descriptive. So you would hope that this time round, I mean, December 17 is our date. So we've got, well, literally a month to go, don't we? 30 days. You would hope that there will be a detailed health direction come out that will give everyone some guidance, because at the moment it still isn't there for Strata.
And to be fair, Frank, that just to pick up on that point, eventually in time, the difference that Strata provides started to get recognised in some of those health directives. There started to be a distinction made about shared facilities in, I think they referred to it as apartment blocks, which is not a great technical term, but anyway. When we talk about legislation, the only really specific body corporate COVID legislation which is in existence at the moment is the so-called emergency legislation. Now that currently is in force up until the 30th of April next year, or an earlier date. And let's just remind ourselves, there is one more sitting week of Parliament this year. So it is possible that that date can be wound back. But for the moment, it's 30th of April.
It's probably unlikely, given they're about to open the borders and invite COVID into the state, but there you go.
Well, it might even get extended for that matter. So the last week of Parliament for a year is generally a bit crazy, so stay tuned for that one. The big issue that remains at the moment is that those emergency laws, among other things, make it clear that if a committee wants to restrict access to common property, and they're doing so in response to a health directive, they can do that, and it's not a restricted issue for the committee. So the obvious example there, going right back to what you were just talking about, Frank, where Dr. Young, or who of course is now a governor, but Dr. Young would say, pool's closed. Okay, so therefore, in order to give effect to that directive, the committee could decide, because the committee still has to go through that decision-making process, to shut the pool. But the important thing, Frank, isn't it? Without a health directive empowering it, the committee does not have that power to restrict access to common areas, do they?
100% agree. And the other thing is that health, those laws are framed as restriction of common facilities to all people, not a class of people. So short of there being some health direction that says only vaccinated people can use the pool, that's not going to be, at the moment, grounds for a body corporate to deny an unvaccinated person access to common facilities.
Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit later about a scenario in which maybe, very, very, very maybe that might work. But it won't work at the moment. We've attempted to split this up into sort of kind of categories or headings. So let's try the first one. So the scenario that we thought of was, okay, if you've got contractors, and that includes strata managers, coming on to common property of your body corporate, what happens if they're vaccinated or not vaccinated, for that matter? What can or should or can't a body corporate do there, Frank?
Well, I think at this point in time, for me, that's a function. So I suppose starting point is, what's the type of engagement that the contractor's got? So, well, actually back up a level. There's nothing at law yet saying that you have to be vaccinated to provide services to a body corporate, as a very specific example. So now the type of person that could come to the common property, you might have a resident manager or employee or contractor to a resident manager. You might have a strata manager. You might have a lawyer. You might have a strata consultant. You might have someone coming to do the pools and gardens and grounds. So first point, I think, is the type of engagement that the body corporate has with that individual service provider. So, for example, with lawyers, our engagement's normally terminable at will on a moment's notice. So if a body corporate committee had a meeting booked with us and then asked me, Frank, can you please make sure you send someone that's vaccinated? It's then my choice, I suppose, to say, well, no, I'm not going to send someone that's vaccinated, or I'll make sure someone is and go along and comply. So that's not so much a direction as an agreement. It is, absolutely. Yeah. And I think then it's a little bit different in a, let's go resident manager context. Let's go the big guys, so you've got listed, your Mantras, your Accors, your Miners, your Oaks, whatever they are, who have big operations, full of staff, coming and going, all given points of the day. What a body corporate has with those arrangements is a contract to provide services. So those services are set out in the agreement itself. I think it's highly unlikely that any of those agreements at this point in time are going to deal with the services only being provided by vaccinated or unvaccinated people. Most of those management rights agreements have the ability for a committee to issue reasonable directions in relation to the provision of those services. But I think jury might be out for a little bit on that, but usually those directions are going to relate to, mate, don't do the gardens and grounds at 6 o'clock in the morning. Can you please do them at 9? or something like that. You know, I don't think it's necessarily going to extend to vaccination status. And at that stage, that then becomes another commercial issue for the service provider in terms of, well, do you want to have a fight with your body corporate or not, if it's important enough to them to try to have that side of engagement.
Yeah. So I think the bottom line out of all of that discussion, Frank, is that it's an evolving set of circumstances, that one. And I think you're absolutely right. It would be highly unlikely there'd be any contractual arrangements at the moment that would reflect that. But perhaps as we move into this next phase, whatever the next phase starts to look like, we might actually see more of that specificity built into contracts, or attempt to be built into contracts. And at that point, that might be where it gets tricky.
It is. And mate, I can tell you, in terms of management rights assignments now, I think it's becoming more common for purchasers to produce evidence of their vaccination or otherwise voluntarily.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So it's sort of, it's on people's minds. So it's a really interesting one, watching that evolve.
Absolutely. So it's an interesting one for strata managers, because they will commonly come to the building, the common property, to conduct an AGM, for example. That's fairly commonplace for a strata manager to do that as part of the terms of their contract. So could they refuse to come if not everybody who's attending is not vaccinated? Well, we come back to that commercial consideration that we just talked about there, Frank. But if there's an agreement between the body corporate and the strata manager and there's no reference to vaccination status whatsoever, that's going to be very problematic. Might need a bit of delicate negotiation to get around that.
Absolutely. And I suppose that's, from a strata manager's perspective, and again, I'm not a workplace relations lawyer either, but making a staff member go to a meeting where they're not comfortable about attending, I think in any circumstances is not necessarily crash hot, let alone when you've got some health overlay. And so I suppose at that stage, rather than, and Chris, this is back to where we all started and still continue to do it, rather than looking at the letter of the contract in terms of what are my rights, what are my obligations, what can I do, all that sort of stuff, what's the alternative ways to deal with that? Yeah. Maybe you send a different staff member. Maybe you have it all on Zoom. Maybe you get rid of the face-to-face bit.
Well, let's look at that then. Let's just say you have a face-to-face AGM. For whatever reason, that body corporate has not endorsed the idea of electronic voting or electronic attendance, and you've got some owners who are not vaccinated attending that AGM. Is there any possibility that the committee could say that they cannot attend?
And I think this is back to, mate, I think the black and white rules that we all try to find in strata that sometimes don't exist. I think that, I suppose this is the limb we might go out on, and we can be provocative and we can ask questions, because I can guarantee you the adjudications on this sort of topic are at least 12 months away if they're going to arrive at all. So until that happens, we're all guessing about what is reasonable. I'd be coming back to the nature of the people attending. If you've got one of the sort of over 50s, over 60s, they're accredited at state level style management rights businesses where everyone gets 2 meals a day and shared facilities and all that sort of stuff, and they're all elderly and they're all potentially capable of having a more severe reaction to COVID than a group of 20-year-olds would, then maybe. And I suppose maybe with a big asterisk beside it, provided that I'd say you're not disenfranchising people from participating in body corporate decision making at the same time. So, mate, you can't come in, you can't come in, you can't come in. I know you're not vaccinated and you're not giving me evidence of your vaccination, so you're not coming in either. I don't think just kicking people out without an alternative would be a reasonable approach. So here's how you do Zoom, get on your phone, in your iPad, whatever it might be. Maybe that's the way to do it. But there's still nothing express in the legislation about that. And, mate, probably there will not be.
No,
yeah.
So that's a good question, that one. I do wonder if that particular scenario is going to come up into the future. I suspect it will in some forms. And that's a nice segue into our next topic heading, which is about occupiers. And remember, occupiers here, we're talking about both owners and tenants. Occupiers accessing common property facilities and their vaccination status. So I think, as we've established already, on the face of it, the pretty reasonable black and white interpretation of things, there doesn't seem to be any capacity for a committee to restrict access to common property on the grounds of vaccination status at this point in time. But as you just alluded to, Frank, there might be a couple of scenarios where you might have to start thinking about that a bit more carefully, hey?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it's sort of really, and mate, this is one of the things always with occupancy of lots is that, you know, invitees can come to the building. So that invitee could be someone coming to visit my unit at my election. It could be someone checking in on Airbnb. It could be someone coming in via the on-site manager or otherwise. And so, one of the big issues, I suppose, with Airbnb over the years, which it has been now, is security, is about making sure the parties, obviously, but probably security and now vaccination status. To the extent that this does arrive, how does that actually work? If a body corporate is going to be entitled to do something or wants to do something, how does it actually check vaccination status and otherwise? And I see we've got questions there, a bunch of questions.
Well, let's address those now then, Frank, because there's a few there. Danielle, thank you for your comments and questions. And Look Up, thank you for your question as well. The question about how or if you can ask someone about their vaccination status. I'm going to answer that by doing this. Frank, what's your vaccination status?
Vaccinated.
Okay. Well, I just asked you what your vaccination status was, Frank. Have I broken privacy laws doing that?
Oh, well, I don't know. I'm just looking at what Section 94H of the Privacy Act actually says. And that looks like it's...
I suppose the point I'm trying to make there is that you didn't have to tell me. You could have just said, none of your goddamn business, Chris. Shut up and get back to the webinar. But you said, I'm vaccinated. And for the record, everyone, so am I. So my take on that question is that anybody can ask anyone anything. It's whether they respond or not, that's the issue. So if you've got a committee that says to someone, I need to see your vaccination status before you can go in the pool, show me. You've got like to show them if you want.
Yeah.
But if you're obliged to, you're not obliged to, not from a body corporate perspective anyway. So you've got to get out of this mindset of whether you can ask. And like I say, anybody can ask anything. It's how and if you answer, or if you are compelled to answer.
And I'm just
does that make sense, Frank?
Yeah, it does. You glitched a bit on me there. And that Section 94H of the Privacy Act relates to COVID-safe apps and consents, and looks like I don't think there's, again, at first glance, in 2 seconds worth, looks like the asking is not a problem. Consequences of people don't answer is a problem. So, and there's a lot of this that seems to be at the Fair Work Act as well, which is actually employment stuff. But anyway, I'm not those things either. I'm not going to do it on the hop. But it's, can ask, but what can you do with the information?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, well, and if there is no compulsion to answer, what are you going to do at that point?
Well, so that's where you go the Novak Djokovic, isn't it? That's a private, personal thing for me, and I'm not telling you. And so the federal government, they said, well, mate, you're not coming into the Australian Open. Well, that's the last time I read about it, as much as that's probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago.
No, that's still the case, Frank. So that's consequence. And I think that's a really good example of consequence. So, John, thank you for tuning in. Could the committee stop unvaccinated visitors from using indoor, outdoor common facilities? We've kind of covered that, and we think at the moment there's no real power for that to happen. Interesting you use the word visitors there, because we're talking about owners and occupiers. Visitors, slightly different kettle of fish perhaps, and we'll get onto that in just a second. In fact, let's get onto that right now then, Frank, because we've got a couple more things we really want to cover off today. So the topic of short-term visitors in holiday letting, that's a big one pretty much from this point for the next 2 or 3 months, isn't it, Frank?
Yep, absolutely. The great Australian holiday season begins with Melbourne Cup Day, so absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
What do we think?
So, well, at the moment, there's no obligation for managers to check people's status, vaccination-wise or otherwise. I don't think necessarily many are going to do that either. There were, in our management rights clients, there were some cancellations when the Premier announced you can't go to theme parks, for example, because people that aren't vaccinated can't go to theme parks. There were some holiday cancellations as a consequence of that. But in terms of actual staying in properties, I don't think most managers will do that unless they're expressly instructed by their owners who own the property to do that. You know, so it's a bit akin to what used to be the case with pets up until the new laws just recently, where whether a tenant was allowed to keep a pet was a pure choice of the owner of the property, and the manager would act on the instructions of that owner. This is probably that same thing. So I don't think a body corporate's going to have the ability to, for a better phrase, intervene or interfere with people's private letting of their units. Although I suppose I don't think it's necessarily beyond a resident manager to potentially say to people, I want to see evidence of your vaccination status when you arrive. That may well lead to lots of people saying, I don't care. It also may lead to some people providing it and saying, happy to be here in a place that supports vaccinations. You know, that's probably still to that commercial.
Yeah, and crucially, when we talk about vaccination status, that's been linked to specific venues and specific activities. As far as I'm aware, and I'm happy to be corrected, but as far as I'm aware, vaccination status is not linked to short-term holiday letting at this point in time.
Nope.
Yeah, at this point in time, let me say that there's still time for it to happen. So I guess the upshot of all of that, Frank, is that we can't see why there would be a need to be asking short-term holiday lets for their vaccination status at this stage.
No, definitely not a legal requirement, 100% sure.
Yeah. But they still will have to do the check-in. That's a different story, the QR code check-in. But we're talking about
they are, and then you come back to hotels may have that, but there's this gap that short stay strata falls in. So a hotel is something, a motel, a premises controlled by an individual entity, whereas management rights is strata lots controlled by various people with common facilities where others can come and go. So I'm not sure. That is something that'll be really interesting when the health directive arrives, because at the moment I think it's a little bit nebulous. And if you look at the policy behind it, if it's trying to make sure that people who don't know each other register, you think it'd push towards requiring that, but I don't think it does at the moment.
You would have thought so.
Some buildings have it.
And let's remember, the government has been extraordinarily clear on this point, if nothing else, that if there is a problem about checking in or displaying vaccination status at any location, the operators are not meant to be the police. The police are meant to be the police. That's been made awfully clear. So I don't think that there is any scope for the body corporate or one of their agents to be performing that role, Frank.
No.
I think we're both in agreement on that.
No, really quick, and the police commissioner was super clear on that. It's the police will do the enforcing. So you can see come December 17, some random enforcement actions in pubs and clubs, and that leading the news that night.
Absolutely. Really quickly, we want to get on to one of the emerging issues, and this is going to be, well, this is basically kicking in now. That's home quarantining. So this is one of the new developments with the first phase of border openings, that home quarantining was allowed, which all sounds great in theory. In practice, there's going to be a few problems in Strata, because one of the conditions for home quarantining is that your residents, at your residence that you're planning to quarantine at, you must have direct fresh air access from the front door. What does that mean? It can only be one of two things as far as we can figure out, Frank. It has to be a house or it has to be a townhouse.
Yeah, not something with a lift or a foyer where a whole bunch of people are walking through. So lifts, and I suppose 3-story walk-ups. So it's a 3-story walk-up where you might go up a side. Yeah, it's, I mean, the health direction refers to suitable premises, but certainly a proper high-rise is not going to be that on any definition, but sort of walk in your own front door without probably going through common areas, yes. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily as public as it could be yet either, in terms of strata.
It's been a little bit made out in a couple of communications that I've seen, but I don't think people have quite tweaked to that, because what it means is that if you own a lot in a high rise, for example, and you're intending to home quarantine, you won't be able to, notwithstanding the fact that you own the lot. Yeah. Or if you do it, you run a big risk of getting yourself into a lot of trouble, because you can lie and say, yeah, sure, I've got a house that I'm quarantining in. But if you are unable to verify your location when randomly called upon by Queensland Health, you'll be in a fair bit of trouble for that scenario. But again, that's not up to the body corporate or the on-site manager to police. That's for the police to police. But I think that's going to become a bit of an issue, that one, for people to understand that we've got a few questions there that we will try and get to. But I think that's a big issue that people will need to understand, that just because you can home quarantine doesn't mean that you will be allowed to home quarantine at a strata scheme. Do we need to say anything more about that one, Frank?
No, I think that's about it, mate. It's probably the wrap of this is we've gone out on a little bit of a limb in terms of having the conversation, I suppose, but it's just, it's got to be had, because these are the issues that are lurking around, but it is going to be evolving. So there will be health directions. There's absolutely going to be media, and they're definitely positioning it for everyone to be ready for COVID to arrive in Queensland. And so when that does, there's probably going to be another round of panic. And this is where these sort of things will start to pop up more regularly.
And there is still more than enough time for a new regulation to be passed that changes all of this again. So as we always do, we like to finish with some best practice and some takeaways out of all of this. And as you just said, Frank, the biggest one is this isn't going away. We've got to try and live with this and make this work in the absence of absolute clarity. And while it seems like things are loosening up a little bit, it's a slow burn. And there's going to be some restriction for a while. I think what that means for bodies corporate, there's no place for snap decisions. And I think the temptation will be there, and it has been there for committees and managers, for example, to make quick snap decisions without going through proper process. While things change quickly, Frank, the body corporate still must go through its decision-making process, mustn't it?
Absolutely. It's got to be transparent and accountable. And part of that, and this is back to where we started with COVID last year, is the communication is the single biggest thing. Because one of the biggest, when everyone's feeling a bit skittish, not knowing why decisions have been taken was one of the biggest issues in March, April last year. So when status quo is changing, communicating why to everyone is a really, really important piece of the puzzle. And that also then makes sure that you're accountable for why you're actually doing that. So why? Where's the health directive? Where's the legislative intervention? Where is the particular reason for that? Because that's what was missing a lot early last year.
And I think the other thing to remember here is that the vast majority of bodies corporate in Queensland will more or less know where they'll stand, I think, Frank. I think the situations are more or less in the median, if you want to think of it that way. But if you are in a body corporate where perhaps things sit a bit outside of that, where you might have some of those issues that we referred to earlier, that's absolutely where you want to be seeking some legal advice, if appropriate, to even consult with Queensland Health. I'm not sure what response you'll get, but you can at least make the effort to do that, and to be seen to at least be going through the process. That's really important. Questions? Alana, thank you. What happens if a strata manager gets COVID from a face-to-face meeting and brings it back to their office and infects other people in the office?
Well, I suppose they all get COVID without being facetious. But if you're talking about liability and that sort of stuff, I don't know. You know what I mean? It's in theory, it's negligence, reasonable foreseeability, damages, all that sort of stuff. So obviously best to be avoided if possible. But and I suppose from the employee's perspective, being put in that position, is that appropriate or reasonable? And these are the things that we'll be working through with this stuff.
Absolutely. Probably the issue there, Frank, in that scenario is if some kind of assurance was given to the strata manager that everyone was vaccinated or everyone has assured them that they were well, and then they weren't after the event, that's a different story potentially. Mandy, more a comment than a question. Thank you. Funny, you need a front door to fresh air, but government quarantines you in a hotel. I guess that's why
until December 17.
That's why they're moving in that direction. Another question from Look Up Strata. Thank you. If you are home isolating in a townhouse, do you have to let the committee know? I've not seen anything which puts that compulsion on you. Should you let them know? Again, there's no compulsion. Is it the right thing to do to let them know? I don't know, Frank. What do you reckon?
I don't know. I reckon that just you go back to the Tony Abbott. No one likes a dobber. So I was standing beside a policewoman once waiting for a coffee in the middle of this stuff and said, how's your job going? She said, it's just so different to what I thought I signed up for. She says, every time they had a lockdown, the job screen just went through the roof with everyone ringing about someone breaking some COVID rule. So they were getting dragged away from doing stuff that probably was more important than knocking on doors.
Yeah. So I guess the short answer is we don't think there's an obligation to let the committee know. If you want to let the committee know, well and good. There might be a circumstance where you do want to let the committee know because of some very practical reason. So say, for example, there's work coming up and it might impact upon your lot and it's in the middle of your 14 days home quarantine.
Termite inspections. Yep.
Yeah, that would be, you'd say, look, sorry, but I can't let you in. So that would be, so it's always case by case. Unsurprisingly, Frank, it was involved, today's discussion, and there was a lot to talk about. We've well and truly come to the end today. I reckon we stay tuned for whether there needs to be another one of these before the end of the year. Yeah.
Distinct possibility. And I suppose answer Paul's question above with real estate agents and prospective buyers, I don't know, mate, what the check-in rules are for those. REIQ could tell you, I suppose, but yeah.
Yeah, I would have thought so. As for Airbnb, it's an interesting one too. Myself, really soon, so I will let everybody know in due course. Yeah, let's stay tuned on that. For now, Frank, thank you, as always.
Thanks, mate. Thank you, everyone.
Everybody, thanks very much for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Oh, and next week, Frank, what are we doing next week?
Well, you're away, and I'm going to talk about what's going on in the management rights market with Vanessa Scortino, who's our newest employee, staff member, I suppose would be the right way to put it. So if you're interested in what's happening in management rights, that's where you need to log in.
That'll be.
I'll try to drive this without you, mate.
I'm sure you'll do it. Again, thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in. Really appreciate it. I'll see you in 2 weeks, and you'll see Frank next week.
Done. See you, everyone.
See you all. Bye.